I'd like to start out by thanking each of you for being here, not just the attendees, but the speakers, and for the Mackenzie Institute for hosting this session, because it reflects a caring and a sense of responsibility for our fate. And I think that resilience really is something that's grounded in that shared responsibility that each of us brings to the table, and that's something that I want to talk a little bit about today and emphasize that it's not just our national leaders who are going to somehow save the world. It's not even just each of us individuals who hopefully are going to have enough food and water at home to survive for a while, but it's all of us, and it's all of us working together collectively who really are going to make a difference. So as Brian mentioned in the introduction, I've had a dual career as an Army Reserve officer and then as a civilian engineering manager. I recently had a chance to spend about 6 years on active duty, partly in the context of the current conflicts in Southwest Asia, but my primary role was to change the way that the U.S. military thinks about energy in its operational domain. And so hopefully what we've been able to do is shift the thinking from sort of a scarcity mentality that you just all need to use less fuel because it's a real problem spending the money and costing lives to escort convoys, to a more of an abundance mentality, and we actually advanced the notion of the energy marksman. And so just like ammunition, we don't tell our soldiers, just don't shoot so much ammunition because we're going to run out. We teach them marksmanship. We teach them to become an expert at using the technologies that we've given them to be the most effective in the field to achieve their end goal. And so one thing that I'd like to talk about today is sort of helping to make that shift from this sort of concern that we have in protecting what we've been able to develop through our technologies and our social advancement against some loss, which we certainly need to have in mind, but to shift the way that we think about it so that we're thinking about what can we do individually and collectively to take advantage of those benefits that we have, advantage of the insights and the capabilities so that we can survive and we can thrive as best we can under changing conditions. So that's what I'm going to sort of touch on today. And I'd like to suggest that we think about an old question. It may seem philosophical, but if a tree falls in the forest, the question always was, if no one is there to hear it, does it really make a sound? And of course, the engineers say that there are twigs breaking, there's wood splintering, pressure waves are produced, and of course there's sound. If you ask an artist, they might say there's really no aesthetic experience, so it really doesn't happen. It's not really a real event. Most other people would just say, who cares? But today, you might care depending on what that tree might have hit. And so now, in today's environment, things that might not have made much of a difference in the past can have a substantial impact both locally and even more broadly on other things. So if you think back to 2003, Toronto actually was involved in this incident. There was a blackout in the electrical power system in the U.S. Northeast, the Midwest, and in Ontario that affected some, 55 million people. Some people didn't have power for up to a couple of weeks. At least 11 people actually died, and probably more people were affected by accidents or other indirect causes because of conditions that didn't necessarily start because a tree fell on a power line, but actually vegetation, tree touches to power lines were implicated as one of the contributing factors, and there were other things that basically ganged up with us and caused this problem. So as we've heard this morning, we really need to be thinking about protecting critical infrastructure, even protecting things down at a very basic level. So in that light, we come up with design wind loads for buildings. We come up with floodplain predictions where water might be high. We provide physical security for important facilities where we know there could be pilferage or attack. We have vaccination programs to try and prevent disease spread. And so those are all logical things to do because we can anticipate these sorts of challenges, these sorts of threats, and so it only makes sense to design against those. So the problem with just limiting our perspective to that protection approach is that things change. And so while we may anticipate these conditions, we may be able to sort of predict what can prevent sort of damage or loss under those conditions, that's all based on hindsight. We look back at what we've experienced and base our planning in that light. So what we've seen is that, for example, we have opponents who modify their techniques. And so before 2001, people had thought about crashing planes into buildings and what might happen, but it really wasn't something that we seriously considered. How would we deal with that? Another thing that's sort of a current threat scenario, as we've heard, is cyber security. And so the increasing line there represents the increasing complexity in cyber attacks that we see on the net, and the decreasing line, unfortunately, represents the reduction in resources that it takes for somebody to come up with one of these attacks because of all the tools and the insights that they have in order to mount those attacks. Technology is proliferating. So about 15 years ago, nobody had a smartphone. And today there's a smartphone for just about every person on the planet if you count one for one. iPhones started initially in about 2007. So the first iPhone hit the market only about 8 years ago, and think of how much that's proliferated and what kinds of capabilities have evolved in that technology. So one might wonder what's coming next, and the Internet of Things certainly has been suggested as one of the possibilities. I recently was looking at refrigerators in the store, and when I opened them up, they had a little instruction sheet on how to address your refrigerator from your smartphone. So it's becoming very prolific, the ability to reach out and capture information from different sources. So big data is a big field of study. So another trend that we might not really think about is that the world is growing older. All of us in here are growing older. We talk about some of the developing nations being much more young demographics, but even those groups will grow older. And so that can affect social attitudes, values, motivations, and so we need to keep those things in mind and try and understand how we can deal with those kinds of change. Water has always been a scarce commodity, and as we see growing populations and urbanization, clean water is particularly a problem, and weather shifts and climate change can really exacerbate that. Even if the amount of water in the world isn't changing, it matters whether you have water right now to drink or this season to grow your crops. And that can end up influencing conflict, economic growth, and so forth. So as a result of a lot of these dynamics that we've talked about, technology, growth, growing complexity, trends of change, one thing that we've noticed is that it seems like things are getting worse. Major events that have, in this case, $1 billion or more of impact are increasing in frequency. That's sort of the bar chart. And they're also increasing in consequences. That's sort of the line chart. So whether or not weather is getting worse or climate is changing, that could be a separate argument. In fact, each incident tends to have more impact on us, and so that is a dynamic that we need to keep in mind. So given this tendency toward complexity and change, that suggests that we need to think about new ways to think about risk. You can't just rely upon the old actuarial mindset that says risk equals the probability times the consequences, because the probability may have been miscalculated and the consequences, we're not really sure how to calculate that. So what could be an alternative then to this protection mindset, or at least something to supplement it? So one idea that we really have started to talk about within the military and also in the civilian domain would be resilience. So protection and resilience both are on the table. How might we look at those differently? Traditionally, the way that we design our systems is we come up with some idea of the requirements that we want to achieve. We design a system to achieve that. We build it, and then we protect that design. We protect that system so that it will continue to function the way was intended. If something unexpected happens, it might fail. If everything happened sort of the way we anticipated, it might survive. Resilience is a different perspective. Resilience doesn't necessarily focus on protecting that system as the ultimate goal. It focuses on whatever outcomes, whatever priorities that you've established for the organization or the enterprise or the community. And so we have to sort of think differently about resilience, and one important aspect of that is that we think of it as sort of a continuum, and you think of it in terms of time. So if you imagine that there's an event on this timeline, we have time to prepare for that event, and as we're thinking about what could happen, we might be increasing our capabilities because we understand a little better how the system works and what we're trying to achieve. An event happens, and we have to respond to it. It might disrupt the way that we're operating, it might disrupt our systems, and so our capabilities might drop, but hopefully we can quickly recover, and even once we've got sort of things back in order, the water's out of the basement, still we adapt and learn, and we continue to improve based upon that learning. And so this sort of continuous improvement, this continuous focus on what kind of an outcome we're really after is the salient point in resilience compared to maybe a more system-centric view in the protection mentality. So going back to applying that, in the military we have standards that say if you have a critical facility, let's put a backup generator there so that they'll have power when the power goes out. And so the computer or the communication node can continue to operate. During Hurricane Sandy, we actually saw some success in that realm. So Sherman Lehman Brothers had a headquarters building in Manhattan that was well prepared. They had backup generators. They sandbagged the building. Manhattan flooded. The lights stayed on in the headquarters building. Computers probably didn't lose some data. There was some real benefit derived from their proactive planning, but it was an isolated effort. And so not only did they suffer from the fact that people couldn't get to work, they couldn't necessarily communicate and conduct all the transactions on an ongoing basis, but a lot of people resented the fact that their lights were on and mine weren't. And so they actually lost some goodwill in all of this because of their responsible planning. Moreover, there's this big picture. And so the goal really isn't just to keep your lights on, it's really to maintain social order, to survive, and to hopefully enable a continued growth in your socioeconomic welfare. And so in order to do that, there are a lot of other functions out there. You have transportation, communications, law enforcement, healthcare, for example, that matter. And all of those have to work together in order for your community really to continue. And so that becomes a real dilemma, and I faced that within the military. It was one of the motivations as I was winding down on the operational energy domain and discussion, that we need to think about how the military fits into that and how communities address this. So Dr. Ayers mentioned, people are going to come to the military bases and expect some sort of help, and the military commanders were just thinking about keeping their computers running. And so that really raises the issue that the military installations and the communities are quite codependent. So communications for military operations actually ride over civilian networks, and so we can't solve this alone. So the first question that the military leaders asked was, well, how do I define this resilience? How do I know if I have it? What are metrics? And so these are a couple of definitions. The first one really represents sort of something relevant to leaders, community or military leaders, sort of a top-down approach, thinking about how do I do this planning and preparation response in order to assure that my enterprise is more resilient. But the bottom definition doesn't receive maybe as much attention, at least among people who are talking about resilience in communities, and that is more of the anthropologist, sociologist view. What about the individuals and the families? And that really sort of an analog to the military thinking about energy. We realize that soldiers win our wars, not airplanes dropping bombs. And similarly, in a community, the people who come out of their storm cellar after the tornado, patch up their neighbors, help rebuild, they're the ones that really represent the most salient elements of resilience in the community. So we need to be thinking about what do we do at the bottom up perspective and what do we do from the top down perspective, both. So a way to organize that thinking, I sort of built a pyramid that said ultimately, we need to keep that survival and welfare at the apex, but there are documents. U.S. has a National Infrastructure Protection Plan that identifies a number of sectors that end up being important. They interrelate. They have 4 what they call lifeline sectors that we sort of focus on, and we could even identify outcomes related to each of those and have sort of a subordinate outcome for energy or communications to try and maintain capabilities, recognizing that the higher level outcome is the survival and welfare. And then on the bottom level, you have this sort of foundational view has been described in resource terms. We'll look at your natural resources and your human resources and the basic capabilities and see how much wealth do we have, how well prepared are we at the foundational level so that we can coordinate all of those. So how do you coordinate all of those? Number one, you need some sort of a framework, and so there are a couple of axes that I would suggest. One is time, and so we talked about sort of 4 phases in terms of event timeline, so before, during, and after. And then another one might be in domains that seem to be important. So physical domain we talk about a lot, sort of our critical infrastructure, but there's also information. If you don't know where the first aid kit is, then it's not going to do you much good. There are 2 human dimensions. Then there's sort of the individual cognitive behavioral side that says, okay, do you know how to use the first aid kit, and are you willing to use it? And then as collectively, we have social policy sorts of things. Are you allowed to use it? Do you have a key? And so each of those sort of interacts, and they have to be somehow coordinated. Well, that raises an issue because in the military, we realize that you have all these different people who are responsible for different things. So the military base commander has authorities. Our healthcare depends upon teamwork with civilian agencies, so that's a different authority. Law enforcement is another authority. And so all these people interact, but if you invited them to a party, they wouldn't even talk. There would be doctors having white wine over here with the nurses. There would be policemen having a beer talking about the Jays game. There would be all these other groups. They don't speak the same language. They wouldn't naturally interact, and so you need ways to bring them together. Going back to the August 2004 blackout, what we actually saw was maybe symptomatic of that. And so if you look at the significant impacts, as I already mentioned, it was a significant event. But if you look at the causes, there was a detailed analysis done that said there were, in fact, salient causes that resided both in the physical domain, in the information domain, and in both those individual and policy domains. And so, in fact, this played out this problem, and you need ways to address that. I'll skip the other slide. So how do we do that? Well, in the community context and in a lot of other enterprises, I would submit that it's important to convene collections of people like we have in the room today, people who are stakeholders in the capabilities, the goals, the challenges out there, and people who might be expert, may or may not have a stake in that, to help inform what is the problem and what can we do about it. And so this sort of circle on the top represents the starting point. You get people in the room together and you collectively come up with an idea of what does the world look like. If I have a financial institution, if I have a community, if we have the challenge of providing energy, what is the scope and what does the animal look like from the different views of the elephant? And then the next step is to come up with assessments of what happens to that system then when it's perturbed. So you might do scenario-based analyses to sort of get at what happens if there's a hurricane or an earthquake or terrorist attack, and these different people can inform that from their expert perspectives much better than a systems engineer might do using traditional logical analysis. Then you move around the circle, you do use some tools to sort of take that expert insight and turn it into some sort of logical model, something you can visualize it. There are expert mapping techniques, there are decision analysis techniques that help you to sort of map those out so that people with different perspectives all can be looking at the same picture. And then once you have looked at what could go wrong, how does the system respond, that same group can look at potential solutions and see if I mix and match different ideas, how would those work together, which might be the most effective even under different sorts of circumstances, again keeping in mind that we have our ultimate outcome goal of surviving and having continued welfare, not necessarily doing things the same way that we always did. So we look for alternative sort of acceptable ways. And then ultimately once you've come up with make sense solutions, the same people who are in the room likely are the ones who would be responsible to go back and do whatever that is. So the utility operator who is thinking about designing a new microgrid or smart grid modifications now knows a lot more about how he should design and program that system to meet the needs of people in the community. So through that process, you would embed the right kinds of insights and ownership within the community of stakeholders and experts to help you hopefully embed resilience more into the organization. So what I'd really like to suggest is that we keep in mind that it's important to keep the end goals in mind, and let's not think about resilience as something we need to do ourselves, but it's better really to be resilient as a group. So let's not be Scherson laymen, let's be a community like you would see in the Midwest or here in Ontario, that we all work together and end up better off together than we would be individually. So thank you.